Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
All right, brother, let's get real for a minute. We have all got a little bit of that victim mentality in us, right? We've all got at least one area of our life where we're struggling and we're not getting the results that we want. And hey, maybe that's someone making more money than you. Maybe you see someone who's more successful in love and romance than you. Maybe you see other guys have the body that you wish you had. When we're not getting what we want, it's tempting to indulge in the idea that the game is rigged against us. And that's why we're not winning. Now, that's not to say that you don't have it harder than others in certain aspects of your life. We're all born into different circumstances, right? Where things like money, race, physical appearance, sexual orientation, and whether you grew up in a loving or a broken home can create radically uneven playing fields. And of course, we all have different life experiences where we collect a lot of evidence as to whether life has its wind at your sails or you feel like you're running with a parachute attached to your back. So yes, we're all starting from different places, but we don't have to stay stuck there. As Viktor Frankl says, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. In other words, you have the choice to remain a victim to your circumstances or to adopt the mindset of a victor. So in this episode, we're going to talk about why being a victim can feel good sometimes. We're going to talk about why you shouldn't pay attention to the evidence of your life up to this point in terms of creating that future version of yourself who you want to be. We'll talk about why motivation is not enough to change and why self-efficacy instead is your golden ticket to change. Brian's going to talk about what episodic future thinking is and why 5,000 peer-reviewed studies show it's the number one practice to develop a sense of self-efficacy and a 3-step process for shifting from the victim to the victor mindset. Let's get into it. So, Brian, for the last few months on the podcast, I've been sharing how I've been dealing with some mysterious undiagnosed illness for quite some time now. You know, it goes back about 18 months, but it's really started to take a downturn over the last 4 or 5 months. Many of you guys know that during the 100 Great Push-Up Challenge, which took place in January, February of this year, I had to drop out of the push-up challenge because my body just no longer could work out. I haven't worked out in 4.5 months now. I've had to reduce my work schedule by about 70% just because I don't have the energy. My mind's not working the way that I need it to. And every test I've run, you know, with doctors and nutritionists, we haven't been able to get an answer. But finally, last week, I did get my answer. I was diagnosed with Lyme disease and Epstein-Barr to a lesser degree, but Lyme disease is the thing that's causing this fatigue, this exhaustion, the brain fog, you know, the high anxiety, the depression, all of the things. It was a scary diagnosis to receive because I know that for some people it can be really debilitating. But at the same time, it was also something I'm quite grateful for because I'm in the hands of a wonderful medical clinic out on Long Island called the New York Center of Innovative Medicine. 75% of their patients are there for Lyme disease, and I'm undergoing a pretty intensive treatment, which started this week, going to see them 2 to 3 times a week, every week for the next 6 to 8 weeks. So finally getting some answers, man.
It sounds strange, but congratulations on your
Thank
diagnosis. You. That space, Dominic, of something's wrong with me, I don't feel right, and I have no answers, also means no direction.
Yeah.
And that is scary. And I know you've been dealing with that for at least this year, and I know a little bit into 2021 also. And while Lyme disease is scary in that it affects everything, it is something that can be worked on. And so, and I know you're taking all the steps to do that. So congratulations on your Lyme disease.
Thank you.
Can you give us just a little bit back? So I've heard of Lyme disease. I know it has to do with ticks. I know it's prevalent in the Northeast.
Yep.
Like, what is it? Give us a little background.
Yeah, Lyme disease is typically, I don't know of any other way that it's transmitted than being bitten by a tick. And ticks are very common in the Northeast United States. What the doctors have believed is that this has been in my system for a long time. And it makes sense because for the last 11 years or so, I've had gut issues. I've had this weird sense of fatigue, kind of like this deep, chronic underlying sense of just tiredness, even though I've got my sleep, my nutrition, my mindset, like the people around, I've got all of those other things dialed in. There's always been that, why don't I feel better kind of vibe inside? And what they say about Lyme disease, it's a very intelligent disease. It waits for you to have your immune system at its absolute lowest, and then it pounces like a vulture. It's interesting because back in late 2020, I noticed that I was starting to lose body fat. I couldn't lift as much weight in the gym.
Dude, I remember that. You came to my place in Brooklyn. You were looking great, nice and lean.
Yeah, on the outside, look.
I think we even took some great photos of you on the rooftop. And I was shocked because at that moment you're like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know if I'm not eating. Maybe it's my cortisol levels. And I know you've been searching since then. So yeah, man.
Yeah. I mean, the quick and dirty, and we'll finish this up and then we'll get to the heart of the conversation because this does lead into the conversation around victim and victor mentality is, for about 9 months, I could feel this decline of what's wrong with my body? And then when I got the vaccines in April and May of 2021, the vaccines introduce a pathogen into your system and it lowers, your immunity. And that's where I started to notice, in the months following, I started to have a real decline in my health. Hired a nutritionist. We came in, we supplemented. I started to come back a little bit. And then I got the flu. It wasn't COVID. I got the flu. And then I got my booster shot shortly thereafter. This happened in December. And once that happened, everything went downhill. So, by the way, this is to say, this is not a pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine thing. Quite frankly, I'm grateful that if this thing was in my system for over a decade or maybe many decades, that now it's gotten to a place where I can actually address it and eradicate a Lyme disease entirely. And maybe it needed to get so bad for me to finally go get the help. But man, it has been brutal.
Dude, so you don't even know the tick.
I don't even know which tick bit me or when it happened.
That tick has been inside you. And have you ever pulled a tick out of you?
Remember we had a men's retreat a year and a half or 2 years ago where we all had ticks on us, but we pulled it out within hours. And I had none of those red splotch. They could have been from then, but chances are it was from many years prior.
If this has been Dominic on low energy for a long period of time, I can't wait to see what Dominic's like after all of this. You might be unbearable. I don't know.
All right. Hold on. I'll be looking for a new podcast partner, I guess. But this leads nicely into this conversation of victim versus victor mentality, because I was on a podcast recently called the Money with Katie podcast. It's one of the fastest growing finance podcasts in the world. It's geared towards women, millennial investors, women who, not investors, but women who want to be smarter with their money in the millennial age demographic. And Katie, the host, started having this conversation around victim versus victor mentality. And I thought it would be really useful for our men as well. And I know it's really pertinent to me because when I was going through the throes of this illness, and then having to cut back my work, not being able to work out, not being able to make money for the business because I just, I was only just keeping the mastermind and the podcast afloat. I started assuming this identity of a sick person. I was constantly surrounded by all the supplements, all the doctor's appointments, all of the feelings that I'm sick. It was deafening. Everywhere I looked, everywhere I walked, every conversation that I had with people. I'm sick. I can't do this. I can't do that. No, I can't hang out with you. No, I can't do. I was swimming in the evidence of my life that I was a sick person. And it was really starting to take root that I was sick. And it was our interview a few months back with Dr. John D. Martini, where he came on the podcast and he talked about when he was 17 years old, high school dropout, doing a lot of drugs, getting drunk on the beaches of Hawaii. He was dyslexic, couldn't read. And everyone thought that he was stupid, including his teachers, and including him. when he had that spiritual experience, going to this guided visualization where he saw himself speaking in front of 1 million people and couldn't understand, like, how could someone who's illiterate speak in front of 1 million people? And his spiritual guide said to him, you're going to start saying an affirmation every day that I'm a genius and I apply what I learn. I'm a genius and I apply what I learn. You're saying that for the rest of your life. When John took on that new identity of I'm a genius and I apply what I learn, and you even asked him the question, Dr. John, did you actually believe that? He's like, no, of course not. There was no evidence in my life to support that. I even went home and told my friends I'm a genius and I apply what I learned. They laughed in my face. He's like, that was my first support group, telling those jackasses. And he's like, but what ended up happening was when I stopped looking at all this evidence that I was stupid and I started focusing on, could I be a genius that apply what I learned? What I noticed at home was I started getting more curious around what would a genius person do? And that's when he saw the encyclopedia on his shelf. And this kind of goes to show you how long ago that was, because he actually had real encyclopedias on his shelf. And he pulled one off and he's like, I'm going to learn 30 words today. And tomorrow I'm going to learn another 30. And the day after that, I'm going to learn another, because that's what a genius would do. And that's what he applies, what he learns. That story, that book has been written. He's, that guy is now a genius. He gives lectures around the world. He's written 40 books. So what I ended up doing was I created my own affirmation of, I'm the healthiest I've ever been, and I get stronger every day. And I say that dozens of times every day. I meditate on that every day. And it was actually like within the few weeks after I started assuming that new identity of I'm the healthiest I've ever been, not I'm a sick person. That's when Mark Krasner, kind of out of nowhere, one of our buddies, sent to me this medical center on Long Island that I originally rejected. I was like, I'm not going to go there. I've already got too many people telling me what to do. But it was that clinic on Long Island that I was like, I'm going to give it a shot. They were the one who tested me, found that I had Lyme disease. They work with 75% of their patients who have Lyme. And now I'm in good care on my way back to health.
There was at least a few weeks between us recording the DeMartini episode and where you're at right now. Did anything change in the interim before you found this and knew that you had Lyme disease? Like, what did that mantra do for you?
The first few weeks of that mantra were pure frustration because there was no physical feeling that aligned with what I was saying. When I was saying I'm the healthiest I've ever been and I'm getting stronger every day, every time I said that, my body would be like, no, you're not, because I couldn't feel any of it. And what Dr. John had said was, it's not about the feelings. Don't come until later. It's you're laying new circuitry in your brain, new neural pathways. It's like taking swings on a golf club, whatever it is, right? Sitting down at the piano, playing the piano, you name the analogy. It's sitting down, doing it over and over and over again. And then eventually something takes hold where you start to make new decisions. And here's the thing, Bri, I was already on my path of like, I think it's a gut issue. I'm going to go get a colonoscopy and an endoscopy to have it looked at. And then I got COVID and they had to reschedule my colonoscopy for a month and a half away. And I'm like, what am I going to do for these next 45 days? And that's when I went back to like, you know what? Mark sent me this medical center and I'm the healthiest I've ever been. I'm getting stronger every day. What would someone like that do? He would look into the center. And I did my research. I found out they were world class. I scheduled an appointment, got one right away. They tested me, found it right away. And now I'm on my way to healing.
Yeah, it's funny, like what goes first, right? So the mantra, I'm the healthiest I've ever been, and I get stronger every day. The mantra, not the feeling, but the mantra.
That's right.
And then the actions, right? And then you can start to see some of the evidence. So it's funny. I think we often look for the evidence first, and that's actually the third thing that comes, right? It's not what's happening right now when we're looking at, moving from this victim mindset into a victor mindset.
I think it's what you just said. Like we could almost stop the podcast here because the most important thing to understand about having a victorious mindset is what is that mantra? What is that new identity? Like the victorious identity that you want to set. You name it. And then you almost like brainwash yourself through like repetition. And Napoleon Hill would call this, I think it's like subconscious programming or autosuggestion. He calls it autosuggestion in the Think and Grow Rich. So you constantly feed yourself that. The actions are step number 2. You take action aligned with what is that new identity, and then eventually you get the payoff. But the payoff comes last, and that's the hardest thing when you don't feel any different. And there's no evidence to suggest that it's working. That faith component, that it will start to shift, is super critical.
I want to come back to this point here in a moment, like this feeling and the faith part of it. But before that, let's talk about being a victim, because there are certain payoffs that we get when we are in victim mode.
Right.
So let's use your example of going through this when you're talking to all the people and, I've got something wrong with me and you're starting to believe this new identity, which is sick Dominic. What are the payoffs for being a victim?
It's a great question. Katie asked that on the Money with Katie podcast. And she asked even, why does it feel good sometimes to be in that victim mindset?
And we all know those people, right, in our lives where they're constantly in victim mode. Like they see the entire world through the lens and somebody's out to get me and this thing's happening to me. And that's the big thing with the victim. It's the belief that things are happening to me and I don't have control over it, right? That's the definition of victim mindset. So continue. Where were you at?
And you know what? We know those people. It's just as important for us to look at ourselves. And there are absolutely areas of our lives where we do the same shit. Whether it's with money, with women, with relationships, with career, like we all have our areas where we play the victim and we often don't see it. And so the two things that I shared with her about like why we love that victim mindset sometimes is number one, you get a lot of attention for it. Okay. So it was interesting on the podcast when I was with her, I shared with her that I'm feeling sick. This is what's been going on. These are the adjustments I've had to make. And she goes, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And I said, see what you did there? You just gave me attention. And we are living in an attention-starved world. Most of us don't feel seen or understood. Like attention is going everywhere else but where we want it, which is on us. Like we want to be seen and understood. Even those of us who shy away from the spotlight, we still want to be understood. And sometimes the only way that we can get the kind of attention or compassion or people's undivided attention is when we play the victim. That's number one.
So the idea of saying, hey, I'm sorry, that gives you the payoff that you were subconsciously looking for.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And then the follow-up questions, what's that like for you? That must be really tough. And it's like, yeah, it is. And, now I've got her as a captive audience.
Yeah.
And when you do that enough, you can become addicted to it. And also you can almost think that that's the only way that you can get that level of attention. It's
almost like you don't really have to do anything to get that feeling or attention. So like, why not keep doing it? That's where the lens comes in. It's like everything's a victim. And while that is attractive, it's also exhausting. It also means that you're not going to move into action, which we'll talk about when we move into the victor mindset. But give us number two, Dom. What's the second thing that's awesome about being a victim?
Yeah, the second thing is we don't need to take responsibility for our lives. Listen, life is hard. And it's very tempting to relinquish or abdicate our own responsibility for how we've been complicit in creating the conditions of our lives that we say we don't want. Right? And Jerry Colonna is the author of that question. I think he said this on the Tim Ferriss podcast. How are you complicit in creating the conditions of your life that you say you don't want? Now, it's important for us to talk about, first of all, that every single one of us have been born into different life circumstances, right? Some of us have silver spoons. Some of us have hit the ovarian lottery, like Warren Buffett says. Being born in the United States in this era, to this kind of family, we all have things in our lives that make our lives easier compared to others. We all have things in our lives that make life more difficult for us compared to others. And there are many people who have a lot more difficulties in their lives than they do have advantages. That whether that's in financial terms, whether that's in your sexual orientation, right? If you're someone who's not a straight human being in this life, in this time, you have a more difficult life being accepted in this world than someone who's straight. And you can do the same thing with race and money and all of these things. Now, having said that, the game may be harder for you. Just like if you're playing poker and you were dealt a 2-7, that's the shittiest hand you can get in poker. It doesn't mean that you can't play that hand. It's much harder to play that hand, but you still can play. You still have chips. You're still at the table. You can still bluff. We could take that analogy as far as we want. You can presumably beat someone with pocket aces, even like if you know how to play the game. So what we're saying here is maybe because you weren't born into money, or maybe your body was disabled, or maybe, all these disadvantages. You can own that, but it doesn't have to keep you stuck in the world is stacked against me. And therefore I can't play this hand. I can't play this game and constantly look for ways to stay on the sidelines.
Stuck is the right word. Because if we stay in that mindset, then there's nothing that we can do, right? There's no self-efficacy, which we'll talk about here in a second. There is, I think, one step, Dominic, and I'd love to hear your take on this, between this thing happened to me or this is just the reality with which I'm dealing with. And there's some sort of emotion associated with that. There's sadness, there's shame, there's guilt, there's whatever. So what's the difference between recognizing that lower energy, that lower emotion, and processing it and moving into a different mindset versus not acknowledging it? Because I know a lot of people that are on this spiritual path, they're just like, everything is good. Like, I'm taking full ownership of my life and this is the way things are. And you kind of forget for a moment that actually this is a shitty situation. Like, you having Lyme disease, like, that sucks.
Yeah.
How have you been able to process like this thing that's very real and not great and then moving out of it?
I feel like I'm more equipped right now to answer that question than at any other point in my life because I've been through like what you're talking about right now. Here's what I found when I was kind of stuck in the victim mindset. When I was sick and I didn't know what was going on and things were being taken away from me. I had to stop working out, socializing, dating. And as these things were kind of being stripped away, I remember feeling like a victim. And then every time I spoke about it to another person, I could feel this dark energy coming up inside of me of just repeating and reinforcing my conditions. And I was just very aware of how do I talk about what I'm going through in communicating this with another person without driving myself deeper into this hole.
Well, and as somebody that was with you during much of this, you weren't quite as bad as Eeyore. And if you don't know who Eeyore is, he's the donkey from Winnie the Pooh that wah, wah, kind of talks like that. You weren't that bad. So you had something going on there. You were at least aware of what was happening every time you told somebody about your situation.
Yeah. So what the bottom line was like getting very clear that I want to be a healthy person. I want to be the healthiest I've ever been. And to say, okay, the only thing that's going to turn the tide on this thing is to set a strong vision for where I'm going. And instead of constantly focusing on, this descent that it feels like. So instead of going downwards, I started creating this vision of like, okay, what does a healthy person look like? What does it feel like in my body to be at inner peace? What is it, visualizing myself running again, standing at the bottom of a mountain, the Flatiron Mountains in Colorado, Boulder, like those kinds of things. What that allowed me to start doing was I was very present to my limitations and how my body felt, but it also started to give me a vision that was inspiring. And what ended up happening was over the course of like multiple days of resetting this new victorious mindset was I started to read more literature around, healthy behaviors and mindset. It was the thing that caused me to take action on actually looking into this medical clinic, which I'd previously rejected because I'm like, nah, I got too many things going on already. I looked into it and it turns out it was the exact place I needed to go. I also, when people ask me about my health situation, instead of getting into the detail, I'm just like, listen, I'm a work in progress, but I want you to know that I'm the healthiest I've ever been and I'm getting stronger every day. Like I reinforce that in every one of my conversations. They're like, really? And I'm like, no, not really. But that's like what I'm saying and I'm living into that. And I can even feel my energy as I'm talking about this with you. It feels, if someone's listening to me right now, that I probably sound pretty healthy because I'm embodying what I aspire to be. And the more often I do that, the better I feel.
Yeah, so you're not ignoring reality. So if we were together over a weekend, you might say like, hey, I need to take a nap at noon to let my body restore.
Correct.
So that I can do X at night with you or whatever. So it's not the ignoring of the situation, but it's where you're at mentally with it, right? So you would tell me because I am the healthiest I've ever been and getting healthier every day, right?
Correct. Like, so exactly. I'm not ignoring the situation. I'm not being like the guy who thinks he can fly. Like, because I say I can fly, I can fly. That's not at all what I'm saying. Still, most of my days, I have, a 30% workload. There's nothing on my calendar these days other than, the bare minimum. For 4 months, I didn't work out a lick. I did nothing. But what I've started to do is, because I'm the healthiest I've ever been, I'm stronger, I'm getting stronger every day. What would it be like to go for a run for 5 minutes? Just for 5 minutes. I started doing that. And for the last 2 weeks, I've taken maybe 4 days where I've run for 5 minutes. Today I ran for 15 minutes. And my body, it's still a chore. It still feels difficult, but I can find myself kind of like, that feels good. And I remember what it's like to breathe this heavy, to feel the sweat on my skin. And I'm paying so much attention to how much I enjoy those feelings. Now those feelings are starting to come back into my body around what it's like to work out again. So these things I know are having a cumulative effect on the man I'm becoming.
The healthiest man.
Yes.
That you've ever been. So Dominic, one of my favorite books is Jane McGonigal's Super Better. And in that book, she outlines a struggle, a physical, biological struggle that she was going through, and a lot of the steps that not only she has gone through, but tens of thousands of people have gone through and really followed this path. The number one thing that she found in all of these experimentations, and true in her own life, is this idea around self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that you have the skill sets and the ability to change where you're at, to affect what's going on in your life. I would say very much the opposite of the victim mindset is this belief around self-efficacy. And what you're talking about in your situation with Lyme disease is it's really difficult in the beginning to say yes, I affirm that I believe I will change this thing, especially when you don't know what's going on. But by setting the mantra, by starting to take those actions, you start to see that evidence. And so that belief, that self-efficacy becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. It's the number one thing that scientists look at when they're looking to take motivation to action.
That's right.
And so sure, some of them might be motivated to get something done or to feel better or whatever, but without that self-efficacy, the belief that I can actually make this change, oftentimes nothing happens. And so that's what I hear you say. When you say this is my mantra, this is what I'm doing, these are the actions, that's what I hear you doing. You're like, I have the ability to change this thing in my life.
That's right on. I remember in Super Better, that was one of the biggest insights I took away from Jane McGonigal's book was motivation is not the driving force for change. It's self-efficacy. There are plenty of people who have plenty of motivation to lose the weight or to stop smoking. In my case, I had plenty of motivation to find a solution. It's when you don't feel like you have the tools, the resources, or the skills to deal with the weight issue, or to break the addiction to smoking, or to get better from this undiagnosed disease. When you don't feel like you have that self-efficacy, that's when you give up. That's when you stay stuck in the victim mindset. So self-efficacy is absolutely crucial. And, one more thing I want to emphasize here before we get to kind of okay, then how do you transition from victim to victor mindset? And how do we kind of create that? I want to say another piece on evidence, because evidence, it's a tricky thing. So for example, if you're someone who's, got this scarcity money mindset, right? Around, I've never had money. I don't know how to make money. I don't come from money. Money is evil, whatever it is, right? If you're someone who's always been overweight, dealt with weight issues, have lost weight, ballooned back up in weight, we have a lot of that, with men in our communities who struggle with that as an issue. Addiction, which is something that, is for me. You could have a lifetime of evidence that you are that person. A lifetime of evidence that you don't have money, you don't know how to make money. A lifetime of evidence that you can gain weight, that you can lose weight, but you'll always gain it back. A lifetime of evidence that a sexual addiction, like in my case, it was always going to be pervasive. That can keep you stuck. That can prevent you from having the self-efficacy to change. And what we are talking about here is your identity in those cases are oftentimes rooted in the past, right? It's from the evidence of the past. Identities are often artifacts of the past, not conscious creations of who you want to become in the future. If you aspire to be someone different, you actually have to leave behind almost everything that you've done up to this point. It's to a certain degree, you have to look at it as irrelevant and to say from this point forward, what I aspire to be is the healthy person who maintains a healthy weight and makes great decisions every single day. I am the person who makes thoughtful financial decisions and knows how to make and save money. And I surround myself with people who have wonderful money habits, who teach me, these kinds of things. The evidence will eventually follow. It's the third step, right, that we talked about before. The first step is, what's the vision I'm creating? The second step is taking those actions. The third step, there's the evidence. And that's essential. Men who are listening here, that is essential for you to hear. Because if you get stuck on focusing on the evidence of the past, you will never change your outcome for the future.
Going back to your situation related to Lyme disease and you being the healthiest you've ever been and getting healthier every day, what is that version of Dominic? What are you feeling when you become that person?
Yeah, like what I envision when I sit down, and I meditate on this every day. The first thing that is, and I saw you just kind of like, make a motion there, and then our listeners couldn't see that. But so for you, that's like a really important thing, is like this meditation and visualization. And maybe I'll explain this and you can talk about the scientific term of what I'm doing here. What I envision when I sit down, one of the critical elements of being the healthiest version and getting stronger every day is that inside I feel a sense of inner peace. And for me, inner peace is where my mind is quiet, where there's a smile on my face. I can feel my shoulders back, my chest is expansive, my heart is open, and I don't need anything in that moment other than my breath. And I start to picture being outside, maybe at the foothills of the Flatiron Mountains in Boulder, Colorado, because that has like a special place for me, and breathing in the oxygen, the air, hearing the birds chirping, feeling the sun on my skin, and just not needing a single other thing from life. And from there, then I kind of start to visualize the food that I eat, who I hang out with, sleeping, exercising, all those kinds of things. And I can tell you bit by bit, it's kind of like the stone cutter taking swings at that stone, with the hammer and the anvil and a big block of stone. You may take 999 swings at that anvil and nothing happens to that block of stone, but it's that 1,000th hit where the block splits in two. That's how I'm seeing, every rep that I'm taking.
And all this new energy that you're going to cultivate and have part of your being, what are you going to do with all that energy?
I don't know if I've gotten that far yet. Part of it is, one thing that I know from the past is when I had the energy you came to know, there was always a bit of like anxiousness infused in that energy. And that anxiousness would cause me to fill all the spots in my calendar, to take on massive goals and responsibilities, and then to quickly feel, the burden, the weight, the heaviness of all of that. And I used to kind of run around like, no, I'm being productive and I'm getting a lot of things done and I'm fulfilling my mission. And because I have this energy, one of the beautiful parts of being in this debilitated state is it's caused me to get really, really mindful of what lights me up energetically and what depletes me. And so going forward, I now have this new internal guidance system of, does that thing give me energy or not? Right? We always talk about what gives you your greatest energy. I'm now more intimately related to my greatest energy and what gives it to me. So when I have that full tank of gas, when I'm fully healthy and stronger than I've ever been, then I will be giving 100% only to the relationships, to the things that give me that juice.
Yeah. I was shaking my head as you started talking about your meditation. And it wasn't because it was meditation. I was shaking my head happy for you because not only do you have this mantra, but you're looking at it in detail. So what does this future Dominic look like? And whether that's future is 5 days from now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, it doesn't necessarily matter. But the idea that you're thinking through where you're going to be, what you're going to feel. You talked about like the food, the taste sensations, the more sensations that we can bring to this healthiest Dominic and getting healthier every single day, the more real it becomes. The scientific term for this is episodic futures thinking, which Jane McGonigal in her second book talks about, Imaginable. But it's one of the most important tools to align what our bodies are going to like feel emotionally in the future. The reason that's so important is because it then shortens the time window between feeling those things and the decisions that we're making today. The easiest way to describe this is if I said, this is not my mantra, but if my mantra was something like, I have the best body I've ever had, and I get more sleek every day.
Sleek.
Sleek. I get more, my body gets more sleek every day, right? Well, that's great. But when the cookie is in front of my face, the payoff is right now, because I haven't really felt what would it be like to have that sleek body, to be in great shape, because that's a future Brian, that's down the road. But when we start to feel like all those sensations about what the future is going to be like, when that cookie comes in front of my face now, the pain of not feeling that sleek body and the payoff of eating that cookie right now, the balance starts to shift a little bit. It starts to get a little bit harder to eat that cookie and know that I'm letting go of that future feeling. So I love that where you are at right now is thinking about that super healthy Dominic in a ton of detail, because it's a scientific thing, man. That's something that is really powerful.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up, the episodic future thinking. And I believe that you said that there have been 5,000 studies. Well, before we hit the record on the podcast, you said
just in the past 20 years, there's been over 5,000 peer-reviewed. These aren't just one-off studies. They're peer-reviewed studies that talk about this. And it's the number one way to develop self-efficacy.
Oh, wow. It's the number one way to develop self-efficacy. That's super important. So bring all this stuff together, okay? Episodic future thinking is this practice of envisioning episodes, like multiple times, of who you aspire to become. Because this is the crux of it, right? If you want to move from victim to victor mentality, what's the transition process? It's about looking forward, a conscious creation of who you want to become in the future, right? Versus looking at all the evidence of the past. I know one of the things that you said before we started recording too is when we're setting goals of our life up to, like say 6 months out or 1 year out, we're often really stuck in the part of the brain that visualizes who we are right now. We always get kind of like incremental around what we think is possible for us. And therefore, we don't really believe that transformational, revolutionary change is available to us. That's why sometimes we need to visualize way further out, which, could be 5 years or 10 years on the scale, because there's a different part of our brain. And I don't have the actual parts of our brain, but I know this to be true, that there are parts of our brain that activate that actually see you as a stranger. Like you no longer see yourself as yourself. I remember we had these commercials when I was at Prudential Financial, and we were trying to figure out, why do people make such shitty financial decisions? Because we know it's smart to save money. We know that like if you put $1 in your 401k account, that in 30, 40 years, it's going to be quintuple or 20 times that. Why don't people do it? And what they found is when we took them into a lab and looked at their parts of the brain, when we asked them to think about themselves in a future state, the part of the brain lights up the same way as if they were thinking about a stranger. So the punchline is we are strangers. Our future self, we're strangers to that. But what's interesting in this world where we're talking about how do you become, the victor, you can look at that stranger and you can break free from the limitations of who you are right now. And you can be like, I can say, I'm going to be the healthiest I've ever been and stronger every day. Brian's going to be the healthiest he's ever been and have the sleekest body he's ever had, which, may not be readily available in this present moment, but you can play with these parts of your brain to say, okay. And then with each episode of visualization, it creates these new neural pathways in the brain, a familiarity. Then the feelings start to come. And I can already start to feel the juices changing inside my body, the hormones that are being released. I can feel it. And now I'm taking these actions. So for anyone who's listening, if it's money mindset, confidence with sexual partners, your physical well-being, your mental well-being, these are the keys to the kingdom around how do you start to transform who you've been into who you want to become.
When we're making our annual goals, let's say, we have baggage with us. And our baggage is our daily to-dos, right? All the responsibilities that we have. It's all of our triggers and all of our stories and everything we've grown up with and all the things that we're good at and we're not good at, all of our identity. And so the ceiling with which we can envision becomes limited because of all those things. Our mind so quickly moves from this is what I want to this is why I can't do it when we have all that baggage with us. What happens when we start thinking about the future way out, the future version of us, the part that you said in the lab doesn't feel like us anymore? Let's just call that 10 years out. When we go 10 years out, our mind switches from a first person to a third person view. That third person view, like you described in the lab, is somebody that's not us. It's almost the same as a stranger. And so what happens when we do that is we lose all of the need for responsibilities or all the to-dos and all the stories and all that baggage that I referred to, so that when we envision that future, it's limitless. It can be a lot of different things. Now, the downside to that, and if you're not trained in this skill set of episodic future thinking, is your mind can fill all those blanks of what the future is going to be with a lot of negative shit. The other possibility I'll throw out there is you can start to think through filling in all of those blanks differently because it's far enough out, and you can do it, and you can do it consciously. That takes effort. That takes time. But that effort and time is part of the juice because you get to something that they call a pre-experience. It's something that you're experiencing in detail in the future right now in your brain and in your body, so that you mentioned neural pathways, so that those neural pathways, as you move through time, are being developed more fully and more robustly. And so that's why thinking out into the future in that third person with limitless view, no baggage, allows us to start moving in that direction even right now and today.
Love this. So as we bring this train into the station, to kind of summarize the key points here, and what you just said about the third person is super important. Right? When we envision the version of us that's like far enough out, we don't think about ourselves in the first person. We think about ourselves in the third person. So the benefits of that is you can break free from the reality of your life and create someone entirely new, right? And in my case, it's like becoming the healthiest and stronger every day. So that's the positive. The drawback to that, and then the thing to understand is when you start to create those mantras, they're going to feel foreign because it's third person. It's not first person yet. So it's actually, you're right on schedule. If like what you're saying, whether it's Dr. John DeMartini saying, I'm a genius and I apply what I learn, but he's illiterate and he's dyslexic at 17, of course it's not going to feel true because you're talking about someone else. You're quite literally talking about someone else. So don't get discouraged. You're right on track. And it's the reps of laying down the new neural pathways. And the way you do that is through this episodic future thinking, which could be the visualization or the mantra or the journaling. We're giving you real practical, tactical ways to go about doing this. Whatever your flavor is, you have to do it, and you have to do it over and over and over again for this stuff to take root.
I've been in situations where I'm so thankful that someone has given me some really good advice. I'm like, man, like that person is so smart. Like, why couldn't I do that for myself? That's the beauty of objectivity because they're not us. The fact that they don't carry the same baggage, they can see our situation from something different. And so the last thing I'm going to hit here, Dom, is why community is so important and doing this together is so important. We can think about the future on our own all we want. And you did that, Dominic, in putting your mantra together. But it was somebody else. It was Mark in this case that said, hey, Dominic, like, would you look at this thing? I know you're going through something, right? He didn't have the baggage of like, hey, I've already tried to do all these things. I already have so much going on my plate. He was able to just give that to you, right? And so having a community that's not like John DeMartini's first group that calls you crazy, but a group that says, that's amazing. I love that future version of you. Have you thought about this? Have you think about this? Have you like, what's that going to be like? Or to drive you a little bit deeper into that episodic future thinking and asking you those detailed questions, because this is a skill that can develop, and it's developed faster and deeper with a group of people.
Hey, if you're listening to this episode on Spotify, would you take a nanosecond and leave us a 5-star rating on the show? If you go to the Great Man Within homepage, right there at the top, it'll show you star rating, and you literally click on it. It says, rate the show, bang, you're done in a half a second. And that gives us an opportunity for the show to raise its profile in the rankings so that other men can stop lone wolfing and find us. Thank you in advance.